and welcome to Hand in Hand's second wellness podcast. Today we're exploring why parents of neurodiverse children, mums and dads, tell themselves that their parenting is just not good enough. Inside of our minds, there's a harsh, critical voice that says things like, if you were a better mother, your child wouldn't behave like this. And this voice is with us at all times, but especially at the more challenging times when we hate ourselves for not being in control of our children's behavior. And I'd like to explore why we do this to ourselves and whether there's a better way to help ourselves and our neurodiverse children. I'm Laura Moore, and I look after the families that approach us for support through Hand in Hand. I also have two of my own children who are neurodiverse, so I have plenty of first-hand experience of what it's like to feel constantly stressed, pushed to my limit, and full of guilt. That critical voice shouts very loudly within me and often leaves me feeling awful, inadequate, and helpless. I've invited Mike Sher to join me because Mike has a sensitive, healthy, and common sense approach to parenting neurodiverse children that resonates with me. Mike, welcome, and tell me about yourself and your approach.
Thank you, Laura. It's a real privilege to be here. So, among other things, I'm a professional executive coach, and I have significant personal experience with neurodiversity. I frequently work with adults who themselves have ADHD and parents of kids who've got ADHD symptoms. I combine a very focused coaching approach with the research that I've done with SEN specialists, with other ADHD coaches, with parents and teachers and head teachers and psychologists. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, and I hope that what comes out of it will benefit your listeners.
Thank you so much. So, listeners of our first podcast let me know that they loved that we gave the example of a real-life story that they could relate to. So today I'd like us to begin by taking a look at another imaginary scenario, which isn't really imaginary. It's the story of our hand-in-hand families, not one family or one child, but a description of a very typical scenario that happens to our families when they try to go shopping. So, Malky is standing in line, queuing to pay for her shopping at her local grocery store. Her son Shlomi, who is 7, has ADHD and some autism traits. He's been loud and boisterous throughout the shopping trip, and now he's reached for a packet of sweets from the shelves lining the checkout queue area. And Malky's feeling her stress levels rise even further. Malky says, "No, Shlomi, put them back." But he doesn't listen, so she repeats the instruction, this time louder and more threatening. She wonders what other shoppers think of her since her child won't follow her instructions. She won't put up with this defiance, so she takes the sweets away from his hand, which triggers him to start shouting and having a meltdown in public. He's shouting at the top of his voice now, "You never give me sweets! You don't let me have sweets! I hate you!" Malky is mortified. She can feel people staring at her, and someone behind her in the queue whispers something, and she's sure it's about her. It sounded like a question, what kind of mother is this? She can't control her child or meet their needs. Can you believe this behavior? Malky is close to tears. She grabs her child by his arm, pulling him close, and apologizes profusely to the cashier and to the people behind her. She leaves the shop, and once her bags are in the boot and her child is buckled on his booster seat, she sits in the driver's seat and cries. I can't even count the number of times I've experienced exactly this scenario or something very similar.
Laura, there are so many elements here that I can relate to, and I know that many of my own clients will as well, so thank you for choosing it. It's very thoughtful. And I'd like to invite all of us, the listeners and you and I, to imagine that we're in that situation now.
Okay.
Take a deep breath and close your eyes and listen to that inner voice that's in our heads. And speaking for myself, what's running through my head is worry for my child. And it's worry for what the people behind me are thinking of me and the cashier. And it's like you said in the intro, it's worry that I'm not good enough. And maybe I'm also blaming myself for what my child is doing. And then because I'm a coach and I tell people they can only be responsible for what is in their control, I'm additionally telling myself off for taking responsibility for other people's choices.
Right.
That's a lot of negative self-talk. I call it narrative, and it's negative narrative. And it's going on really, really fast. Multiple times a second for some of us. So for those who can relate to this, you might find you're feeling a little bit breathless and emotional, having relived that negative narrative. So take a deep breath, because you're not there in reality. And I'm going to segue onto problem solving, because something that I found very, very profound, but not easy to hold on to, is that in reality, we shouldn't be solving every problem. Mm-hmm. Again, if you're like me, you probably grew up thinking that a problem is really a demand for a solution. In the Western world, you demonstrate value by solving problems, right? That's
Definitely. Yeah.
It's a lot of how the business world works. You make life better by solving a problem. But in the world of family and other relationships, it turns out that the real value doesn't come from solving problems. It comes from how we develop as a result of those problems. Laura, I'd like to return to Malki now and ask, what do you think the problem is? And more interestingly, what can she develop in herself? What's under her control, really?
Right. So I guess the problem here is the expectations that Malki holds in her mind, that her impulsive child with ADHD and autism traits will or should be able to behave like a neurotypical child throughout the whole of the shopping trip. And I guess this is complicated by the fact that sometimes Shlomi will manage a shopping trip without difficulties. So she's now expecting all shopping trips to go without a hitch.
So if she could bring her expectations into line with reality, it would actually help her to find that area of control, however small it might be, that she has. And that's all she's responsible for. Everything else is not her problem or her responsibility.
Right.
And finding that little bit of control over her expectations, that's the key. That's what's going to let her go into that place of control again and again once she's found it once. And that is going to bring about better days. It's not days that don't have problems. It's not days without unpleasantness, because days without problems and unpleasantness don't build resilience. They don't give us the opportunity to be good role models for our children. But better days are days where we feel better and we have more enjoyment in them.
Absolutely. That really resonates with me. I can see how she's setting herself and Shlomi up for failure by wanting something that she knows is only occasional, that it should somehow magically transform into something constant exactly at the time that she wants it. And I'm wondering, why do we do this, even though we know this model keeps failing us?
I think it's quite deep, actually. There is an aversion that I've noticed people have to discomfort. And we seem to think that if there's discomfort, it's bad.
Right.
Or we're bad. And I wonder if we flipped that on its head and we said discomfort is not pleasant, but that's not the same as bad.
Absolutely.
What if we simply lived through it and came out on the other side, having coped?
And realized that we're still okay.
And we're still okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It really makes sense. Can we just look at how Malki can take control of her expectations so that our listeners know how to do this for themselves as well?
Sure. Let's see if we can put this into practical terms.
Okay.
And as someone who's got ADHD, I tend to jump off and jump around. So pull me back.
Okay, I will.
Thank you. I think the first step is for Malki to say out loud, I'm going to clarify for myself what my expectations are. Now, you and I, Mike and Laura, sitting here recording our podcast, we can do this.
Yes.
Because we're not actually in the queue with a screaming child.
No.
When you're in that queue and there's screaming, it's really hard to clarify what your expectations are. So you have to have done it before that, when you're in a quiet space.
While you're emotionally regulated.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So to all of those out there who are Malkis, like I am, figuratively. Please pause the podcast now, and try to write down or just note in your mind what that whirling set of fearful expectations is that you know will happen the next time you're in that situation. Really bring them out and see if you can do so to such an extent you can put them into words.
It's great practical advice. Thank you. Okay.
And that's the first step.
Right. Okay.
The second step is to say, those are my fearful expectations. But what can I realistically expect to happen in a situation like this? And I think that there's actually two parts to step two. The first one is pretty simple, and it's just to look at the things that triggered us. It's Shloimi acting out, Shloimi not listening, me hearing someone whispering and thinking they're talking about me and judging me, and Shloimi not behaving like a neurotypical child. The second part is much more interesting and requires us to be honest with ourselves. It's allowing us to say something like this: I'm probably going to be embarrassed, and I'm going to find it uncomfortable, and I'm going to wish I wasn't there, and I'm going to wish Shloimi wasn't doing that. And it's not going to be an ideal shopping trip. It's probably going to be really hard. And then step 3 is the one that I really, really like, because it builds on all of those. It's when we say to ourselves, okay, I know what my fearful expectations are, and I now understand a bit more of what's going on in me, but with all that going on, what response could I do that when I'm out of the situation and I look back at it, I go, I'm really proud of myself for having chosen that response.
Right, and that response is going to vary depending on the circumstance and depending on the person. But what do you think Malki should be aiming for right now, right here?
So before I answer that, because I do want to, just to everybody trying this, and I hope everybody is, it may take a couple of minutes of quite uncomfortable thought and reflection to find your own personal answer to this. For Malki, I think her answer might be something like, I'm going to be proud of myself for not shouting at Shloimi, and for not apologizing, and for accepting actually that the world is full of different people, and not every person is going to behave in the standard way all the time. And I'm going to come out of it feeling uncomfortable, but I'm going to come out of it having been nice and loving to Shloimi. And when I reflect on that, I know I'm going to see that I'm stronger and more resilient than I thought I was.
That is so beautiful. And Malki should be extremely proud of herself if she manages to respond in that way. It's just not easy in the moment. It's not easy.
No, it's not. And that's why we actually do this thinking outside of the moment.
Right.
But there's a really good thing that happens. After doing it outside of the moment a few times, we start to behave like that in the moment. And the magic is that automatic voice in our head, that negative narrative, it starts to recognize and acknowledge that actually I, Malki, am the kind of person who's facing a difficult situation. I'm going to find it uncomfortable. I am going to act in a way that makes me proud and builds my relationship with my son, and I'm going to be more resilient than I was before. And it's such a different narrative.
She's building herself.
She's building herself.
Yeah.
So let's return to explore for a second why Malki, if she could zoom out from her daily hectic life, and she'd be able to see then that her expectation is that Shloimi, who's highly impulsive and anxious, she expects that he should be able to behave the same as kids who aren't highly impulsive and anxious.
Right. So from her zoomed out perspective, she will probably say that she doesn't expect it because she can see it's obviously unrealistic.
Obviously.
But in her daily life, when emotions are a big driver of our reactions, she wishes so much that it would be so in order to avoid feeling the shame and the embarrassment about his behavior. And also so that her child Shloimi shouldn't be left out or labeled as different, which parents are so fearful of.
Yes. And I think that there's almost a stream of emotions and assumptions behind that. And they're kind of logical. They probably go something like this. My Shloimi, surely he knows it would be better not to act out. And because he's often able to choose his behavior, so I know he can, he's obviously going to choose not to act out. So how realistic do you think this is? Because as I'm saying it and thinking about it, it feels pretty much spot on and realistic, doesn't it?
Well, I'd say it's very realistic that I want to avoid feeling embarrassed, or that I want to avoid my child feeling left out. Looking at the assumptions, I think my child does know that it's better not to act out. I've told him enough times, and I've modelled the correct behaviour for him, and I've praised him when he's behaved appropriately, and everyone has a choice, right? So why shouldn't he choose to not act out, given these reasonable reasons? So I'm not sure what I think now.
And maybe the reality is, and I do believe this is the reality, we can tell a person with ADHD and autistic traits something loads of times. But if they haven't learned it, it's not in their heads.
Yeah, that is true.
No. And being told off or being told to do something is not the same as internalizing it.
No, definitely not.
So we might have seen them nod to us when we tell them something. But
he's nodding.
I was hoping you would say that. But the reality is the nod doesn't mean that it's gone in. You know, it may be that your son is on the iPad and he's going, "Yes, Mum, I heard you," when he didn't, because actually Roblox is in his head and in his ears.
Yeah.
Not Mummy. And I think that actually there is another explanation here, which is that not everyone genuinely has a choice about everything all the time. You yourself will know when something stressful has happened at work, or you're really hungry and thirsty, or you haven't slept enough.
Yeah.
You don't have the same level of choice.
No, I don't have the same emotional stamina. I don't have the same level of patience. I do not behave in the same way.
Right.
I'm not in control.
Right. And for people with ADHD and autism, it's kind of like that, but amplified much more of the time, much more of the time. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that you'd like to share.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think I struggle with the fact that my neurodiverse children sometimes do seem to be able to make good choices, and at times they really do behave beautifully. But I suppose that, yes, it's when external factors have an impact on their ability to regulate themselves that it can become difficult for them, or impossible. Going back to our story, Shlomi had endured a boring shopping trip in a stressful, maybe overstimulating environment, a loud environment which caused the perfect storm for him. And he has little ability to manage that storm at the tender age of 7. I do accept that these children do not have the same capacity to manage themselves, definitely.
Yeah, they don't. And if they can't manage themselves, then they actually can't choose their behaviors as often as we'd like, even if there are times when we see that they have. And a few minutes ago, I did talk about aligning expectations with reality, having realistic expectations, and that gives us more control. See, most of the time what we do is we have default positions that we learnt from our own experiences, from our parents, from people we respected. And in many cases, those default positions were tailored for the lives of the people we learnt them from, not for us.
I get it.
So if we were to follow those 3 steps and reset our expectations, we can now be in control of our lives again. And that inner voice actually stops being the voice of someone else from a different set of circumstances and becomes relevant to us. So if I can continue for a little bit longer, it means that the Malkis amongst us are in control of our expectations again. And when we go shopping, and we choose to go shopping, taking Shlomi with us, we're expecting it to be difficult. We're expecting him to be boisterous and impulsive and explosive if he grabs something and we take it away. And we have those expectations instead of hoping against the likelihood that it's not going to happen. I wonder if you can share a reflection on how you think this updated expectation changes Malki's inner dialogue and her feelings.
I think it's life-changing, because Malki has regained control over her inner world again. Her inner voice can sound much more compassionate now that she's having a rational, pleasant conversation with it. So in the past, she might have said things like, I dread going shopping with Shlomi. He's such a nightmare to handle. I can't focus on what I need because he's running through the aisles, disturbing people and touching everything. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed of myself that I can't get him under control. And I'm worried about people are thinking of me. You can probably tell I've had this conversation with myself a few times because I'm very good at it. But now she's invited to have a compassionate dialogue, which will sound much more like this. This is hard for me, and that's okay, because I'm human, and it's natural that I feel a bit apprehensive when we're out in public. I know that Shlomi finds these environments challenging, and who can blame him? In some ways I also do. It's busy and noisy and stressful, so let me just remind him that he's doing great, and that it's not much longer till we get home now, and I'm going to give him a tasty treat. And my poor Shlomi, perhaps I will think about doing more online shopping to spare us both this torture, if that's possible.
Laura, I think it's sounding really good. And above all, I think it's sounding practical. So I'd like to encourage all of our listeners to try this and to realize that it's going to be hard the first few times, and it probably won't look like it's working the first few times. But rather quickly, it does tend to work. I've seen it, and I'd really like to hear over the next few weeks and months from our listeners if they've tried it and what they found.
Yeah, we just have to stick at it, don't we? Mike, thank you so much for joining me and for helping me to understand how a slight shift in focus can help me to regain control of my expectations. I really love that we've taken something so small but so powerful as our focus, and I'm going to try to be mindful from now on to check my expectations and to try to speak to myself more compassionately, and I invite our listeners to do the same. Do keep me posted with feedback regarding whether you, our listeners, felt this was a useful tool and whether you've been able to internalize it and use it in your life. Wishing all of you renewed strength and positivity on your parenting journey, and have a great day. Hand in Hand is a unique social care volunteering organisation assisting families who are facing challenging circumstances. We provide personalised support for families that meet any of our 5 criteria: mental health, single parent, children with additional needs, pre- or postnatal complications, and other extenuating circumstances. If you live in North West London or Manchester and would be interested in discussing your eligibility, find us online at www.hih.org.uk. We look forward to hearing from you.